Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love by Is This Self-Care? Narrated by S.E.P. Chapter 22. Lughnasadh, the Top of the World. Monday afternoon consisted chiefly of pursuing shambling corpses raised by a necromancer in Slough. Draco occasionally had trouble distinguishing the corpses from Slough's fine citizens, but that is a story for another day. He arrived in Hogsmeade to meet Granger at 4 o'clock on the dot. He found the village exceedingly quiet. Most of the shopkeepers were on holiday, and the remaining villagers had retreated indoors to avoid the heat. Draco hurriedly arranged the front of his robe so that they fell just so about his chest, and to get his robust pectorals. He passed a hand through his hair to ensure that it looked ruggedly tousled, as befitted an Auror having done rugged, manly sorts of things. Then he reclined against a lamp-post to wait for Granger, intending to project a cool, casual, uninterested sort of vibe. It was ruined by Granger almost apparating into him. They fell and untangled themselves from one another with gasps. "You had to choose this precise square inch to apparate to?" asked Draco tactily, dusting off his robes. "You couldn't find anywhere else to lounge about than the main thoroughfare? Really?" Granger picked herself up. "I think my foot was in your spleen. I felt it." They regained their feet and regarded each other in a kind of mutual assessment. It had been almost a month since they had last seen each other. Granger had that overworked look about her again, the deep smudging under her eyes, the drawn mouth. She wore a yellow sundress, as though this obnoxious cheerfulness would obfuscate her fatigue. It did not. "You look bollocksed," said Draco. "Thank you. Might I inquire about the eyeball you've got draped over your shoulder?" Draco looked down. Whatever corpse he had most recently dealt with had left an eye, and a long optic nerve curled over the back of his arm, quite ruining his cool and casual vibe. "Right," he said, vanquishing it. "Souvenir from this morning's mission. Won't its owner miss it? He was dead, so no." Granger's eyes raked over the rest of him, but there were no more rogue body parts to be found. She gestured down the road. "Shall we?" Irma agreed to meet me at 4:15. "Irma?" "Madam Pince." "She's still with us? Merlin! I'd quite forgotten about that old bird." They walked. Draco checked in on himself and was pleased that he was feeling none of the fluffy shite that had so terrified him. He merely appreciated the sight of Granger's legs, which was normal enough. She did have nice legs. Draco noted that there was no stream of information directed at him. No "Look, Malfoy!" No gallivanting through the undergrowth to point at a leaf. Perhaps Granger was tired. This was, at his best reckoning, her first day off since midsummer, and that holiday had hardly been a relaxing time. Too many death nuns. There were more than the tiredness, though. There was also a kind of reserve coming off of her. She was keeping her distance. He wondered, wildly, if she, too, had noticed something, and whether it had frightened her as much as it had frightened him. Perhaps she, too, was quashing things. The idea was stupid and based on absolutely nothing but speculation, and there was something comforting about it, nonetheless. They came to the Hogwarts gates, which swung open at their approach. The old gates and winged boars seemed far less imposing than Draco remembered. "Have you been back here since our newts?" asked Granger, observing him out of the corner of her eye. "No," said Draco. "You?" "A few times. Mostly to say hello to professors or for the library." They walked to the school from Hogsmeade seemed laughably brief. Did we really take carriages to cover this much ground? That wasn't even 10 minutes. "I suppose it's far for a 12-year-old wee legs," said Granger. "Everything seems small." "I know." As the castle itself came into view around the bend, Draco was pleased to find that it had retained its aura of magic and mystery, even if it too looked smaller than he recollected. "Smells the same," said Draco as they walked into the entrance hall. "Wood, old stone, schoolish." "Better, rather," said Granger, taking in a breath. "No hordes of grimy children during the summer. When I was here last winter, there was a definite whiff of teenage boy in the air." Now they were in the castle proper. Draco was not particularly prone to nostalgic reminiscing, but he had spent many happy years here, and 2 horrid ones, and he rather enjoyed the wander through the old corridors. They, too, felt narrower than in his youth. He recalled the suits of armor towering over him. Now he looked down on them. They peeked into the great hall, where the 4 house tables stood, scuffed and bare, awaiting September 1st. The room had always felt so grand, the tables almost interminable. Now Draco wasn't certain that he could squeeze his way onto one of the Slytherin benches without kneecapping himself. The enchanted ceiling was the deep blue of high summer. They continued past empty classrooms that smelled of chalk and years of spilled ink. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. Granger grew visibly excited as they neared the library, though she was doing her best to appear restrained. When she reached the heavy doors, she paused to rub a palm against the well-worn handle. She pulled open the door, and the smell of the library met them. Old books, vellum, worn leather, and dust. It was potent. Draco felt 14 again. "Feel as though I've got a potions essay due," he said. A smile broke on Granger's face. Mine's transfiguration. Madame Pince watched their approach from her desk. Draco was quite convinced that she still wore the same hat and pointy shoes that she had when they'd been students. He half expected a telling off from her for talking. She, too, seemed small. Granger was greeted by Madame Pince with something approaching warmth, a pinchy, reticent sort of warmth. Draco had observed with surprise, doubly so because he was with Granger. "Strange sort of bedfellows," sniffed Madame Pince. "Work," said Granger. Pince passed Granger a record card. "The Y-Press manuscript. I know that you can handle rare books, Miss Granger, but do be especially careful with this one. I've taken down the wards for you." Granger thanked her and led the way to the restricted section, which housed the bulk of Snape's collection. The air grew stuffier and pressed their ears as they progressed deeper and deeper into the library. Whatever rudimentary ventilation cooled the castle did not come to the library's inner reaches. It was hot, and had the stacks always been this narrow? "Prime snogging stacks, these," said Draco in quiet. Pince couldn't hear. "I remember," said Granger. "Do you?" Granger gave him a glance. "You needn't look so surprised." "Curious, rather," said Draco. "You must have been a brave lad. Les was Weasley. He doesn't count. Can't, mostly." "Don't be mean," hissed Granger. "But no, Ron wasn't my first snog. Victor had that honor." "Victor?" "Crumb." Draco gave a low whistle. "Good for Victor." Granger had come to a halt at a shadowy place between stacks. "Just here, if I'm not mistaken. Those shelves made decent handholds." "The tales these stacks could tell." Granger observed him wryly. "I'm sure they'd have equally bawdy tales about you." Draco smirked at her instead of answering. She looked away. She was right, of course. Much teenage exploration had happened amongst these shelves. His first blowjob, he thought. Unless that had been in the common room. He couldn't remember. But he didn't remember many romps with girls in short skirts through here, pushing them up against the books, tongues and fingers fumbling about. And now he was here again, but the only skirt to chase was Granger's. His eye wandered to her backside and her legs as she walked ahead, until he caught himself wondering what she would look like pushed up against the books. Then he gave himself a mental box in the ear. No, he was not doing that. He was quashing. He was getting sweaty. He cast a cooling charm on himself, and then on Granger from behind. She squeaked in surprise as goosebumps broke all over her arms. "You're welcome," said Draco in response to her dark look. The restricted section had been enlarged to display the Snape collection, but otherwise looked much the same as it always had. Draco waved his wand out of curiosity, grinning as he illuminated the various nasty wards and jinxes strewn about the shelves. "Pince has a flair for it, I'll give her that," said Draco. "Perhaps she missed her calling as a nun." "You ought to suggest that to her. It'd be a laugh." "A laugh? She'd kick me in the bollocks with her pointy shoe." "I didn't specify who would be laughing." Granger squatted down to search for her book. When she found it, she heaved the large manuscript to her reading table. She paused to push a strand of dampish hair from her forehead. Instead of settling down to read, as Draco had expected, she merely took out her mobile and began to, if he was understanding it correctly, take photographs of the pages of interest. The problem with Granger was that she always came with new intrigues. She never bored him. Why couldn't she bore him? It wouldn't be easier for all parties if he wasn't being perpetually stimulated by her. Intellectually, obviously. "How, pray, is that working in bloody Hogwarts?" asked Draco. "Hmm? Oh," said Draco, flipping over her mobile. Attached to its back was one of her anti-magic pucks. "I'd forgotten about those things. Terribly useful. I can't go about my life without my mobile." Granger bent over the reading desk to take the photos. Granger did not look at her. In fact, he turned away from her and conjured a mirror and attempted to salvage his hair. "It'd be far more convenient for me to review this manuscript at home," said Granger. "But Madame Pince would never let me remove it from the library. So I'm doing the next best thing. The digital photos. Don't tell her. She'll think I'm stealing the book's soul or something." "Right. I'm rather glad you're not settling in for a read. I'm sweating my plums off," said Draco, removing his robes and popping open his collar. Granger directed another cooling charm at him, and then on herself. She pulled her hair into a coil above her crown and pushed her wand through it. Draco, having done his best with his own coif, came beside her to observe the manuscript. It contained diagrams of medical procedures and medieval patients in various states of distress. He noted that Granger was staying well away from him, though she was being casual about it. If he approached, she found a reason to shift to the other side of the table. If he joined her there, she went around again to take her photographs from a different angle. Should he be offended? Should he be glad? He didn't know. He felt offended, but that was because witches didn't generally flee from his vicinity. "Do I smell like a cadaver?" asked Draco. "What?" "Me. Rotting corpse? Whiff stuff? Yes or no?" "No," said Granger with a quick glance up at him. She returned to her photographs. "Good," said Draco. When he approached her again, ostensibly to examine an illustration, she didn't move away. So he'd made his point. To what purpose, he wasn't certain. Granger snapped a few more photographs, took a moment to examine them on her device, then pronounced herself satisfied. She closed the manuscript with great care and toddled off to replace it. "That's it?" asked Draco. "Yes. I did warn you that it would be boring," said Granger, leading the way out of the stacks. "You shouldn't have bothered to come." Draco shrugged. "It's a nice change, the company of the living. You have slightly more vitality than a shambling corpse." "You have such a way with words," came her dry response. "It quite undoes me." Draco was unable to pursue this interesting conversational twist because Pince popped out from behind a shelf. "Finished? Already?" "Yes," said Granger. "I've just put it away. It's ready for your wards. Thank you again for coming in during your holiday, just for me. I am terribly grateful." "Always a pleasure," said Pince, but her look was profoundly suspicious. "I rather thought you'd be here for a few hours at least." "Yes, well, I had a specific chapter to review. Nothing more." "You look rather sweaty." "Well, yes, it's hot back there." "I see. You made very quick work of it. The manuscript, I mean." "Yes, as I said, my approach was quite focused." Said Pince, narrowing her eyes and becoming, if possible, even pinchier. Her black gaze moved to the sheen of sweat that covered the two of them to Draco's state of relative undress, with his unbuttoned collar and his robe slung over his arm. "The library is for reading, you know." "Indeed," said Granger, blinking at her. "Reading and research, not other activities." Granger looked rather like she suspected that Pince had grown slightly barmy. Quite right. I suppose we'd best be going." "I suppose you ought to," said Pince, her gaze now traveling to Draco's face, and his hair, and his collar, and then his fly. They left the library under the weight of her stare. "What on earth was that about?" asked Granger when the doors had safely closed behind them. "Has she gone a bit potty?" asked Draco. "Did she just eye my bulge?" "She did. I'm disturbed." "Me too. I wonder what—" In a moment of shared realization, Granger turned to look at Draco just as he turned to look at her. "Was she implying that we were doing things?" gasped Granger, appalled. Draco looked back at the library doors. "I think she thinks we popped in for a fucking quickie." Granger pivoted so rapidly that her skirt swished into a circle around her thighs. "I'm going back in there to set things straight with her." "And if we're wrong?" Granger paused. "Are we wrong?" "I don't know. Perhaps she just wanted to look at my bulge." Granger held up her hand. "Enough about your bulge. We have bigger things to deal with." "Excuse you? What if we're right, and she tells someone?" asked Granger with a horrified intake of breath. "That would be a laugh." "A laugh? No, imagine if she told McGonagall." "I didn't specify who would be laughing." "If you're going to imitate me, kindly bring it down an octave. That was piercing." Granger strode back to the library. "And why wasn't she sweaty?" she called over her shoulder. Amused at this turn of events, Draco waited for Granger to set things straight. He leaned next to the slouching suit of armor, pressing his back into the cool stone. A few drying charms got rid of the worst of the dampness at his armpits. Perhaps he hadn't stunk like a cadaver. Perhaps he had just been sweat. Granger was back. There was a storminess in her stride as she marched down the corridor. The suit of armor beside Draco straightened up and saluted. "So?" asked Draco. "She's gone," said Granger. "Couldn't find her. She must have left from the east entrance." "Write her a letter," shrugged Draco. Granger rounded on him. "A letter? Really? You want me to put this absurdity in writing? Dear Madam Pince, you looked at Malfoy's budge, so we weren't sure if you had jumped to the conclusion, but please be advised that I did not get off with him in the library. Sincerely, Hermione." Draco was unable to hold back a laugh. He walked ahead of her, feeling that it might be safer to be out of swatting distance. I'm delighted that one of us is amused, said Granger, striding up behind him with fire in her eyes. Draco came to a sudden stop. Granger walked into him. Ouch! What? My common room, said Draco, gesturing to a flight of stone stairs on the right. That way. Let's go. No, I came here with the explicit permission to use the library, not to take Draco Malfoy on a nostalgic scenic tour of the castle. What if Filch catches us? What if Filch catches us? Repeated Draco, descending the stairs. Oh, we'll send us straight to detention, I expect. He glanced up to see that Granger had a hand on her hip. Now she was 14 again. She looked as though she was hoping for a prefect to pop by, so that she might tell on him and have house points docked. Draco continued down the stairs. He heard her ugh of irritation, and then, at length, her footsteps clattering behind him. It was noticeably cooler in the castle's lower levels. The inhabitants of the familiar portraits started as they passed, then waved, or gasped out a comment. Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy! Proper grown-ups now, cried a medieval sorceress who followed them through several paintings. Look at them! Did someone say Draco? Said a snide sort of voice. A black-haired, goateed man popped his head over the edge of a frame. Hello, Phineas, said Draco. Why are you here with her? Asked Phineas, jerking his head towards Granger. Work, said Draco. Now a knight galloped into view along with a wide seascape. Ah, Hermione Granger, well met, my lady, well met. Granger, who kept glancing over her shoulder as though McGonagall might materialize and give her a scolding, smiled at the sight of the knight. Sir Cadogan. You are with this rapscallion, are you? Said the knight, pointing at Draco with his sword. Are you here under duress? Granger glanced at Draco, as though wondering whether to say yes, and have him suffer the fury of an 11-inch oil painting. No, I'm here willingly. It turns out he's all right. Is he? Asked Sir Cadogan, flipping his visor open and observing Draco. Stout-hearted? He's an Auror, you daft bugger, said Phineas. Of course he's stout-hearted. Risking his neck for imbeciles daily, I'd wager. Me? A daft bugger? How dare you? You, sir, are a curmudgeonly old scrote, and I am going to remove your tongue. Sir Cadogan lowered his visor and clanged towards Phineas, who exited the painting rather swiftly. Farewell, my lady, echoed Sir Cadogan's voice as he too disappeared. Then came to the potions classroom. The door was ajar. Draco walked in. Everything looked the same, only smaller. The well-scrubbed worktops, the row of beaten-up sinks, the cauldrons heaped along the black wall. Draco made his way to what had been his work table for 7 years. Granger stood indecisively at the door, then followed him in. I wonder who the new potions professor is, she said, observing a bookshelf near the door. They're quite modern, anyway. They've got Buxton's works, and keys. Snape preferred the 19th century masters. Bit of a traditionalist. She turned to look at Draco and found that he had disappeared. What are you doing? Draco had crouched under his old work table and sent a lumos under it. Ha! He said. Granger's knees came into view, but then her face as she crouched next to him. Draco pointed to the crude cock and balls carved under the desk. Wow, said Granger. Left my mark, said Draco. Enduring legacy, to be sure, said Granger. She shuffled under the desk on her knees, examining the rest of Draco's oeuvre, which consisted chiefly of his own initials. What's this? She asked, pointing to an oblong sort of blob. A hedgehog? Draco crept closer to study the mysterious hieroglyph. A conker? Asked Granger. Draco shook his head and said gravely, I believe that is what 12-year-old me thought lady bits looked like. Granger burst into laughter. A hedgehog, repeated Draco with exaggerated offense. It has an eye, said Granger, pointing at a speck. Conker hunting will now take on quite an exciting new meaning, mused Draco. Hopefully your knowledge of female anatomy has improved a little. I've remedied the gaps in my knowledge since. I have a few anatomy texts I can lend you, if you need help, so you know where to poke the hedgehogs. Unnecessary, but thanks for your generosity of spirit. Granger was looking at the hedgehog and pressing her hands to her mouth to keep from laughing again. The moment felt surreal. Draco was in the Hogwarts dungeons, crouching under a potions work table with Hermione Granger. He had spent 7 years in this dungeon, staring at the back of her head, hating her. And now, somehow, almost 2 decades later, they were back. A respected Auror, an esteemed healer, on their knees giggling about yonic conkers. He had a strange moment of regret that it had taken this long, and that they had spent so much time loathing each other. And then he had an equally strange moment of hope that it wasn't too late. Too late for what? He didn't know exactly. Their knees touched. Granger pulled away. She rose and dusted herself off briskly. Right, enough of your conceptual vulvas. Let's get to your common room. Draco extricated himself from under the table and joined her. Granger attempted to lead the way, but it soon became clear that she had no more than a general sense of where the Slytherin common room was. Over here, called Draco as she took a wrong turn. Haven't you ever been? Granger turned around and caught up to him. I didn't have many Slytherin friends, so no. They stopped at a nondescript wall. Granger looked about curiously. Here? Yes. The next question will be the password, of course, said Draco. You want us to stand here and guess? Let's have a go. For 5 minutes, Granger. I'm not asking you to blurt out Slytherin-y things for the next week. Granger looked doubtful. What sort of Slytherin-y things should we blurt out? Famous Slytherins, ingredients, ethically questionable spells, anything you could think of. They called out guesses, plants and potions and curses and creatures. Rafflesia, Vermiculus, Banshee, Imperata cylindrica, Flesh-eating slug, Herbidian black dragon, Cascada, Mountain troll, Locomotor wibbly, Belladonna, Nargle, Bloody Baron, Thestral, Basilisk. Not even a quiver from the stone. Granger seemed to take it personally and began to warm up to the exercise. Takacharinteria, she said, a hand on her hip. Endomorphous. Meliphors, tried Draco. Urkling? Parseltongue. Salazar's bollocks. Granger twitched strategies and began to list posh things. Fox hunting. Tweed. Sabridge. Draco tried some Latin for variety. Nope, I'm not going to even try to read this Latin. Gillets, said Granger. Regatas. Pym's mustard trousers. Black market organs. Puffskin. Blood-sucking bugbear? Melon baller, cried Granger. Godric Gryffindor is an absolute muppet, said Draco with great authority. A shudder ran through the wall. Granger gasped. Godric is a bellend, a tosspot. Godric couldn't organize a piss-up in a pub. Godric is a useless fucking wanker. Godric is a right numpty, a pillock, an infantile pillock. Godric has saggy balls. Godric is a slobbering plunker. A thicko, Godric the Gormless. Quite! A nasally kind of laugh emanated from behind them. Phineas had slipped into the painting of a mountainous landscape. This is wildly entertaining. Granger leapt into the air and looked guilty. Her cheeks were flushed as she addressed the former headmaster. Hello again. Have you still got your tongue? Obviously, said Phineas. Oh, good. We were just, breaking into the common room, said Draco. To what end, pray? Asked Phineas. Draco shrugged. To reminisce about days gone by. You want to reminisce? With Hermione Granger? Granger held up her finger. Actually, Oh, yes, interjected Draco. We are reliving our terribly fond memories of one another. I was under the impression that you hated each other, said Phineas. Oh, we do, said Draco and Granger at the same time. Draco felt that the assertion would have been more credible if Phineas hadn't just caught them giggling at a wall, shouting about Godric's balls. Phineas looked at Granger, who was blushing furiously, and then at Draco, who met his eye with a smirk. You make even less sense than you did as smelly pubescence. Congratulations. Thank you, said Draco. Password is Gertie Root, said Phineas, disappearing from view. Only because you managed to make me laugh. Don't get bodily fluids on the upholstery. While Granger sputted at the effrontery, Draco turned to the wall. Gertie Root. The wall opened to reveal the dark, polished door that led to the Slytherin common room. Draco pushed it open. It looked as though the school had been made some efforts to lighten up the place. The greenish, bulbous lights of Draco's day had been replaced by gas lamps that lent a warm glow to the room. The furnishings looked much the same they did as in Draco's youth. Tufted leather sofas and high-backed chairs, ornately carved tables and cabinets. Gilded mirrors shone in the shadows. The elaborately carved stone fireplace was unlit. On the walls around it, portraits of famous Slytherins were displayed. Merlin was reading something and spared Draco a raised eyebrow. Salazar's chair was empty. Phineas did not reappear. There were 2 new additions amongst the portraits, Slughorn and Snape. Slughorn was napping with a bottle of Ogden's Old held snug in his arms. Snape's black-robed silhouette lurked at the back of his portrait, brewing something. Draco ran his hand along the back of the sofa. For 7 years he had plotted and schemed here. He had presided like a little lord over his group of friends, many of whom were dead now. He felt terribly important here, terribly savvy and wise and adult. Now it felt like a children's playroom. The desks for their homework, the house rules pinned to the notice board, the faded banners celebrating past House Cup victories, the bookshelves with their worn textbooks. It was all so small. Granger sniffed. They ought to replace the rugs. It smells like feet. Granger could always be counted on to rout the sentimentality out of anything. She wandered to the far edge of the dungeon, which extended partly under the lake. Now this is interesting, she said, having come to the windows that gave into the water. There's a better view from the dormitory, said Draco. Come on. She followed him down the corridor and into the boys' dormitory that had been his for 7 years. A window into the lake took up the entirety of the western wall. Fascinating, said Granger, stepping up to it. The giant squid passes by now and again. Merfolk, too. Draco left her to his observation. He walked into the circle of the 5 green canopied beds and took up the rest of the room. Goyle, Crab, Sabini, Knot. Dead, dead, alive, alive. Finally he came to what had been his bed. Surely, surely it hadn't been this small. It had always felt so vast. He stretched out on it and chortled. His feet hung over the edge. Granger drifted over, having heard his laugh. No giant squid, but I see that a giant Malfoy has taken possession of one of the beds. I can hardly believe that this is the same bed. Did you carve any genitalia into it, so we can authenticate it? Draco turned to examine the bedpost. Do you know? I don't think I ever did. Granger perched herself on the edge of what had been Knot's bed. She passed her hands over her bare arms. Didn't you find it dreary in here? Can't imagine how cold it was in the winter. It wasn't too different from the manor, shrugged Draco. We had the fire going, and warming charms, and hot toddy and fire whiskey. A group of Grindylows was drifting by the window. Granger turned to watch. Again, Draco was struck at the incongruity of the moment. Hermione Granger, in a bright sundress, was with him in his childhood dormitory. He wondered what young Draco would have thought of it all. What would he have done if now Draco had told him that Granger would grow up to be pretty, and witty, and terrifyingly clever? That she'd boss him about a little, and that he sometimes enjoyed it? That he'd make her laugh, on purpose, just to see it? He'd tell him he was being a sloppy fucking wanker. Difficult to disagree. Have you reminisced to your satisfaction? Asked Granger. Yes, said Draco. Better to move on than to continue to think wanky thoughts. Granger rose. He watched her skirts pass the bed. A whiff of her soap followed. He quashed a not-quite-formed idea involving Granger in this old bed before it could reach a shape and then, horrors, live on in his mind. They retraced their steps out of the dormitory and through the common room. Draco took a final look around. He might not be back here for another decade. Would it even be smaller then? His life pelted relentlessly onwards, and his childhood memory shrank and shrank into an ever smaller pinprick of light behind him. Granger was smiling at him. What? Asked Draco. You really did come to reminisce, said Granger. You've gone all wistful. Draco shrugged. I think it's rather sweet, said Granger, looking wistful herself. She looked as though she caught herself then, and grew serious, and strode away. Do you want to go to your common room? Asked Draco. She shook her head. I come here more often than you. Another time. Granger made for the corridor they'd come down, from the potions classroom. Draco caught her by the elbow and showed her a quicker way out, up a narrow staircase that led straight to the entrance hall. Why had he caught her by the elbow? He had no reason to catch her by the elbow. He could have just said something. That was stupid, and a failure of quashing. He let her climb the narrow stairs first, because her bum was right there. He looked at his feet all the way up. Granger peered into the great hall again on the way out, hoping to find Pince. She was not there. Granger muttered some words of irritation. They exited the castle and descended the steps onto the gravel way that led back to Hogsmeade. The air smelled of sweet grass and the delicate fragrance of willows that bordered the lake. It was good to be outside again. As they came into Hogsmeade, Granger drifted towards the 3 broomsticks. I am properly famished. Have you eaten? No, said Draco. No lunch either. The corpses put me off. Granger wrinkled her nose. Well, you're welcome to join me, but it won't be quite the rush-array as the Manor's fare. She tried the door of the 3 broomsticks, only to find a notice indicating that they were closed until September. They walked on to Madame Puttyfoot's, which was equally shuttered. Finally, they reached the Hogshead. Granger hovered indecisively at the door. Not sure I'm this desperate. I've heard it's gone quite downhill since Aberforth retired. What? Can't be that bad for a pint and a bit of pub grub, can it? It could. Draco and Granger were welcomed, if such a cheerful term could be used, by a man who looked more like a Scroot than most Scroots do. He looked irritated that they dared to give him business. That was the red flag number one, that this was going to be a uniquely terrible experience. They asked for a pint. They were told that there was no ale left on the premises. That was red flag number two. At this juncture, a wiser pair would have upped and left, but a kind of curiosity had been lit in them, to see how bad this could actually get. We'll take what you've got then, mate, said Draco, and a bit of whatever's in the kitchen. They sat themselves at a grubby table near what had probably been a window once, except it was now coated with grime. The Scroot dropped 2 smudged glasses onto the table and poured out something clear into them before stomping off to the kitchen. A powerful odor of turpentine washed over the table. Ranger sniffed at her glass and her eyes watered. Oh my, it's going to be a proper sinus cleanser. Can't be worse than Af Puddle's absinthe, can it? Asked Draco. Cheers. Granger kicked up her glass to Draco's with a worried look. She took a generous swallow of hers. He threw back half of his. They both sputtered and coughed. Burning, choked out Granger. That's some first-class nectar, hacked Draco. I've never felt so alive, sniffed Granger. They drank again to confirm that it had been that bad. It had. Granger was a weepy mixture of laughing and coughing. Draco lost most of his voice. What the hell is this stuff? Asked Draco hoarsely. Was it distilled in a toilet? Inquired Granger. The Scroot had placed the bottle on a shelf behind the bar. Draco levitated it to them. It was troll vodka. The label included a warning that it was not to be consumed neat and to please drink responsibly, which was red flag number 3. But hey-ho, in for a knut, in for a galleon. 88% ABV, gasped Granger. Brilliant. I had just wanted to begin this week with a spot of alcohol poisoning. It's fine, said Draco in his broken voice. We'll have food soon. In retrospect, there was such beautiful positivity in that thought. The Scroot emerged from the kitchen with plates. Steak, he grunted as he slapped a plate of it in front of Draco. Salad, he said, dropping that one in front of Granger. Bangers and mash, he concluded, throwing the final dish between the two of them, before scrooting away. Draco and Granger observed these offerings. Was this steak cooked on a radiator? Asked Draco. Granger examined the gray lump. It needed at least 5 more minutes under the hairdryer. They turned their attention to Granger's salad. It consisted of half a raw onion. Shocking, said Draco. Granger retained her sang-froid. She pulled the bangers and mash towards them with a kind of grim optimism. But why is the sausage so shrunken? Asked Draco. Perhaps it's cold, suggested Granger kindly. Or nervous, nodded Draco. Granger bit her lip. It looks like a prolapse. Draco laughed. It hurt his throat. And what's this? Asked Granger, poking at an indistinct piece of grisly fat. Lard, Voldemort. My God. The mash looks all right. It smells like hot cat sick, said Granger, knocking away Draco's fork. Do not try it. Nothing will come of this except cataclysmic diarrhea. Draco, who did not want a runny bum, set aside his fork. They looked at each other. I think this might be a cry for help, said Granger somber. Should we ask him if he's all right? Draco was less inclined toward sympathy. I think we've just discovered a blatantly obvious front. Well, that too, said Granger. Are you going to investigate? I'll pawn it off to one of the newbies. Granger was beginning to look a bit wobbly in her seat. She squinted at her almost empty glass. Guesses as to our blood alcohol content? 200% approximately, said Draco, not stuttering, but close. The booze was starting to hit him, too. Let's totter off to find something actually edible, said Granger, rising. She swayed on her feet. Oh, bloody hell, I can't apparate. It offends me to pay for this, said Draco with a gesture to their untouched repast. He nevertheless dropped a sickle onto the table. I can, said Granger, grasping at a pocket. No, said Draco. I insisted on trying this place. You get the next. Fine. You were right, after all. It wasn't quite as riche as the Manners Fair. As they staggered out of the pub and ambled down the street, bumping into each other at various objects as they went, around the corner was a little grocer's, just about to close up for the evening. They raided the last of the bread basket and bought a small wheel of cheese to go with it. Granger found some cherries, and Draco discovered an enormous, slightly squashed blackberry pie. Granger asked if they ought to buy a slice. Draco said he wanted two, personally. They stared at the pie and then, their wits and willpower down by 2 inches of vodka, bought the entire thing. A cool bucket of cider topped it off, and that was dinner sorted. They meandered a small way out of the village, looking for a place to sit. Granger said that she fancied a view of the village. Draco said he wanted to look at the castle. They found an adequate compromise up a small path that led to a grassy sort of promontory, from where they could look out onto Hogsmeade and Hogwarts both. Granger asked Draco for a handkerchief, which she transfigured into a blanket and spread onto the grass. The blanket was rather more triangular than square, but then again, Granger was rather more sloshed than sober. Loose-limbed and wobbly, Granger decanted herself onto the blanket. Draco flumped down beside her. The bread, slightly chewy, was parted out first, in hopes of belatedly absorbing some of the troll vodka. Granger said, "I am utterly hammered," around a mouthful of it. There was a kind of serenity to her, a calm sort of acceptance that she was completely bollocksed, and that was how it was just going to be. She had great difficulty putting a piece of cheese on her bread. Draco attempted to help, but her piece of bread kept multiplying into 2, then 4, until he blinked, then it was 1 again, swaying gently. "Hold still," said Draco, snatching her wrist. "I am," said Granger. "You're the wobbly one." Draco, with painstaking focus, managed to place a piece of cheese on the bread. Granger, hiccuping. The cheese fell off, bounced off her knee, then rolled into the grass. She watched it go with a gentle sort of sadness. Draco gave up on her and focused on his own bread and cheese, which he put together moderately well. His only difficulty was finding his own mouth. Fascinating," said Granger, watching him mash it into his chin. "You're usually so elegant." "Am I?" "Yes," said Granger. "You make everything look effortless, you know." "You're drunk enough to compliment me. This is a thrill. Granger chewed. "It was an observation. You can get cheeky when you can put a sandwich in your mouth. Not before." Draco managed to do so, then inhaled to say something, then choked on a crumb. As he coughed, Granger came to the rescue by floating the bottle of cider towards him. This was done with decidedly less finesse and wand control than usual. She had presumably been aiming for his hand, but the bottle pressed into his groin instead. "Steady on," said Draco. "Sorry," said Granger, flinging the bottle over his shoulder and clipping his temple with it before dropping it into the basket next to him. "Wow," said Draco. Granger set aside her wand as though it were a dangerous thing. Then she pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked like she was holding back a shriek of laughter. "I'm so sorry. Not what I wanted to do." "It's fine," said Draco. "Bit of frottage with a cider bottle. New experience." After the troll vodka, the cider was spectacular. Fresh, tart, bubbly on the tongue, and honeyed in the finish. Draco drank and passed Granger the bottle. He had intended to make an eloquent remark on its aroma and notes, but what came out instead was a slurred observation that it didn't hurt to drink. Which was all the endorsement Granger needed, anyway. She drank 2 and passed it back. There was nothing interesting about sharing a bottle with Granger, about tasting where her lips had been in a moment before. Nothing whatsoever. And he wouldn't think about it. And he wouldn't look at her mouth, either. "Stop looking at me," said Granger, holding a hand in front of her mouth, which made Draco aware that he was looking at her mouth. "Can't even eat a piece of cheese." "I'm not looking at you," said Draco, like the liar he was. "I'm looking at the view." "The view is behind you," said Granger. "Oh," said Draco, turning around. "Right." "You weren't joking about the 200% BAC," said Granger, edging nearer to him on the blanket, to look at the view too. Hogsmeade's quaint streets curved away into the growing dusk below them. Farther away, Hogwarts Castle was a silhouette, its windows reflecting the last of the red sunset. "You should draw it," declared Granger. "What? I don't draw." "Liar. I know you've got an artistic streak. I saw your magnificent Willy." Draco tried to resist, but a giggle escaped him. Granger looked at him with wide eyes. "Can't decide if that was adorable or terrifying." "Both. Just like me." "You are neither," sniffed Granger. "Calm down." "But I am elegant." "If you take the ramble of a drunken idiot for fact," said Granger. She was attempting to look prim. "The drunk mind speaks the sober heart," said Draco. He tried to wiggle his eyebrows, but he wasn't sure what he managed to do. Granger merely looked perplexed. "Shall we have some pie?" she asked. "Unsubtle change of subject, but yes," said Draco, waving his wand at the pie, which floated towards them. Would you like a bit of frottage too? Granger crossed her legs. That was an accident. Of course. Make us some cutlery, would you? I hardly trust myself to. She plucked at a few dandelion leaves for the purpose. She transfigured them into two very credible spoons, though they were slightly green. The forks were a different matter, a formidable creation, not a Lughnasadh. Unearthly. It hurt their heads to even look at them. Draco and Granger grew frightened and threw them off the cliff. Anyway, they had the spoons. Draco set the pie to floating between them, and they ate and got crumbs all over themselves. The troll vodka was wearing off. Now they were simply drunk, not utterly cabbaged. Granger, staring at the Hogwarts castle, drifted into introspection. You know, today has been more interesting than I thought it would be. Didn't imagine I'd ever see the Slytherin common room, much less your dormitory. It did feel quite strange seeing you in there. Against the natural order of things? Draco thought about it. Can we really call it a natural order? What do you mean? They're rather artificial divisions, aren't they? The Slytherin and Gryffindor business? Goodness, said Granger, pulling her knees to her chin. Are we getting philosophical? Yes, said Draco. I'm drunk. Indulge me. Of course. We mustn't let the opportunity go to waste. And you're right, entirely artificial. But schools have to divide and conquer the masses of children somehow. I suppose it keeps them manageable. There might be a better way to do it than pseudo-horoscopic enterprise involving underdeveloped character traits and talking hats, mused Granger. My primary school assigned our houses at random, but then it was a muggle, and they hadn't a talking hat. Draco finished the last of the pie and threw bits of crust to some sparrows. Granger, apparently not trusting herself with the wand, got up to fetch the cherries. If we're going to critique the system, after today, I think there might have been a downside to all the inter-house secrecy. What do you mean? The hidden common rooms, the isolation between the houses, it's terribly humanizing to see someone on a bed. Are you saying you might not have thought me such a dreadful creature if you had seen the pillow I drooled on at night? Exactly, laughed Granger. But really, I mean it. You were an entity that popped up out of nowhere, said awful things, and then vanished until the next skirmish. I had to adopt guerrilla tactics to avoid the slapping, said Draco. That was once, said Granger. She ate a cherry. The secrecy fostered fractures above and beyond those that created by the house divisions. That's my position. Why are you smirking like that? Only thinking that a great many witches have formed a great many ideas after seeing me in bed. But a treatise on the house system is an entirely new one. You are terribly full of yourself, you know, said Granger, looking away to hide her amusement. Of course I am. Have you seen me? No, I haven't. Your feet are always in the way. Draco, already close to the rocky edge of the promontory, turned and dangled his legs over the side. There. Granger played along. She moved to sit beside him, ostensibly to observe him. Draco noticed that her reserve from earlier in the day had vanished. Was it a drink? Conversation? Him? Which made him realize that he himself hadn't been quashing, and now that she was next to him, things were beginning to happen again. The beginnings of that sweetness in his veins, the buzz of his pulse. He ought to move away. He ought to occlude and separate his rational self from fuzzy thought and feeling. He ought to. Right. Let's have a look, now that I can see you properly, said Granger. She ran her analytical gaze down his face. Feel like a textbook, said Draco. Perhaps I shall read you like one, now that my view isn't obstructed. You don't read. You devour. I'm frightened. As you should be. Have I got any marginalia? Amusement pulled at Granger's mouth. You do listen to me sometimes. What's the human equivalent of marginalia? Perhaps this? She asked, running the back of her finger along his end-of-day stubble. It was the lightest, most casual brush of a finger along his jawline. The thudding answer of his heart was utterly disproportionate. In which case, yes, continued Granger, but only a day's worth of marginalia, at my best guess. Not half so fascinating as Revelations, you know? Draco was somehow simultaneously rooted to the spot and floating. He was nerveless. He was all nerves. His pulse was up. This was bad. He ought to occlude and pull away from her and also jump off the cliff. Instead, like the weak-willed cretin he was, he continued. What about illuminations? He asked. Have I got those? If his voice was husky, it was because of the vodka. Oh, that is an interesting question, said Granger. She grew thoughtful in her study of his face. She smelled like the notes of honey from the cider. I would have to say your eyes, she said at length. Is that dreadfully trite? It is, said Draco. I forgive you. You haven't a poetic soul. Are they sumptuous illuminations? Oh, yes, splendid. They're a glitter with silver leaf and everything. I ought to give myself to the head librarian as a gift. She would make good use of you. Although, perhaps I'd rather remain in the Granger private collection. Granger gave a theatrical little gasp. Bold! She curates it fiercely. I wouldn't be so certain that you'd make the cut. My illuminations, though. They are tempting. Their eyes met, and there again was that pull from her dark gaze. The drawing towards, the beckoning, the invitation to fall in. It inspired a soft sort of longing in him, a wanting to reach out and a wanting to fall, strange and gentle vertigo. He knew that she wasn't doing it on purpose. He knew that she hadn't set out to do so. There was no calculation in her. She didn't even know what she was doing to him. And yet, there he was, falling, falling. She blinked and looked away. He had been staring. So, what's your conclusion, Professor? He asked, throwing in a Granger irritant to ensure he had sounded normal. Have you completed your assessment? If there was any irritation on her part, it was diluted by amusement. Have you got any family in Hogsmeade? She asked in a casual sort of way. Draco saw her coming. If you're about to suggest that I look like our barkeep from earlier. A wart yearning for self-expression. Oi! Thank you for removing your feet from the picture. It brought me a real clarity. Then, seeing his annoyance, she looked skywards. Stop fishing about for compliments. You know you're terribly good-looking. Draco smirked. I never tire of hearing it. You grew out of being a greasy little ferret. There, a compliment. Are you happy? Yes, I'll have another, please. No, you're unbearable. Do my hair next. No. Yes. She narrowed her eyes critically. Then her fingers ran through the ends of his hair, only for a moment. Draco did not permit touching of his hair. Those who were foolish enough to try were hexed into quivering pile of mints. But Granger. Her brief touch was far more intoxicating than any of the drink he'd had today. There went his pulse again, shooting upwards in another disproportionate fix of excitement. Middling, said Granger. Draco sniffed as though he was letting the remark pass with sublime equanimity. Really, he was too floaty to give a damn. Granger pursed her lips and brushed her fingers through his hair again, switching his part to the other side. Adequate, you know? Decent. One day you'll find someone who can look past it. She was holding back a smile. His eyelids felt heavy. His body felt light. He wanted to reciprocate some kind of teasing compliment, but he oughtn't have. He wanted to tell her that she was like the vodka, intoxicating even in the smallest measures and leading to errors in judgment. He wanted to taunt her about she ate cherries. Who bit cherries in half? It must be because of her tiny mouth. He wanted to tell her that if he'd outgrown his greasy ferret phase, she'd moved well past her startled squirrel days. He wanted to make suppositions about why her wand was pushing things into his groin. But that would further blur the already indistinct line between teasing and flirting. And he wasn't meant to be flirting. He was meant to be quashing. He was meant to be remaining cool, neutral, unaffected, aloof, professional. She was his principal. He stole a glance at her. She had turned away to resume her perennial battle with her hair. She loosened it. He smelled the shampoo, and then pulled it into a ponytail. And he wasn't looking at her nape, where the small curls escaped and the skin was most sensitive and kissable. He wasn't looking at the scalloped edge of her dress, where it dipped between her shoulder blades. He wasn't looking at the zipper. Right. But what if he just moved in behind her and pulled a bit of her dress off her shoulder and pressed his mouth to that spot? Draco folded his hands into his lap. He could not trust them. She was his principal. He grew dimly aware that he was heading for disaster. Granger, blithely unconscious of the turmoil caused by the back of her neck, pushed a final hairpin into place. Then she put the little basket of cherries between herself and Draco and sat next to him on the edge of the promontory, so that her legs dangled next to his. They talked. He tried not to look at her cherry-reddened mouth, tried not to think about the wet rim of the cider bottle that they passed back and forth. Their shoulders touched now and again. He felt the occasional brush of her curls when the wind teased them his way. The breeze brought hints of her towards him. Cider and shampoo, and the salt of skin in summer heat. Would it truly be so terrible not to quash, just for now? He had quashed for weeks, after all. He knew he could do it again. He could simply enjoy right now, and go back to quashing afterwards. Couldn't he? It would be fine. Wouldn't it? He had everything under control. They threw cherry pits into the shrubbery below the promontory. Granger said that they'd make a pretty grove of cherry trees one day. Draco chased the pits with the herbivicus charms. His aim was true. Here and there below them, the pits split and pushed forth small, tender leaves. Granger, delighted, cast a few aguamenti. The evening light grew delicate and elusive. Granger leaned back on her hands and sighed. There was contentment in it, happiness even. Draco felt her gaze on him. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," said Granger. "Tell me." "It's maudlin, vodka-fueled sentimentality." "Even better." She chose her words carefully, but at length spoke. "I'm glad you kept the protection assignment." Now she wasn't teasing. Now she was sincere. Draco felt a smile, unbidden, flash across his face. A new and unfamiliar joy swelled in his chest. "Do you know? So am I," said Draco. She gave him a sideways glance. There was a blush on her cheeks, or it might have just been the last of the red sunset. Maudlin. Frightfully. Something danced in the beats of his heart. They both went for a cherry at the same time. There was a tangle of fingers. The touch was fleeting, hasty. Anything would be too sweet. The evening air was summer caught in a breeze. Crushed grass and clover. A curlew sang. And it was beautiful sitting next to Granger with his arm brushing hers, here at the top of the promontory, which at this moment felt like the top of the world.